Good morning to everybody and welcome to all the participants in Europe where we have around lunchtime and across the Atlantic where it's still coffee time early in the morning. My name is Carmen Hoffman. I'm the Secretary General of EABH, and today we're going to have a conversation about development banks, about their history, their impact, their role. And the idea is to have the conversation with all of the participants, but as well with our experts, Aldo Musacchio from Brandeis International Business School, Daniel Diaz from University of Cantabria in Santander, and Professor Rudolf Schmidt from Goethe University in Frankfurt, who will give an expert comment on the topic. So, first of all, let me thank the EBF Institute and Leibniz Institute SAFE for their support with this event. And as a small disclaimer, in case you wonder about EABH, EABH is an international independent nonprofit organization, and we encourage research into the history of finance, policymaking, and the archives. And as such an organization, we're a small player, and it's a very competitive world out there with often big institutions. So we rely on individual donations. Therefore, if you value independent financial history research, please join EABH as a member. That could be as an individual or with your institution as well. It's very easy. Just go to our website, look for the membership form, fill it in, and send it back to me. But now let us start to talk a little bit about state banks and how well they perform. A technicality before I hand over to Aldo to start. Since we're going to try to have this as like an open conversation, whoever has a question and wants to have the question in person can raise his or her hand. And I will promote you to be visible on video so you can ask your question. If you prefer not to be visible, however, put your question in the chat or the Q&A function, and we will try to do our best to include as many questions as possible. Yeah, that is it from my side. So please, Aldo, tell us, do States Bank do good?
Good morning, and thank you for the invitation, Carmen, and to EABH for the support. They've been supporting my research since I was very, very early in my career, so I'm very grateful to be here. And the funny thing, I should say, this is the interesting thing, and the reason why I woke up at 5 a.m. to be here with you at 6 a.m. in Europe is because some of these topics in the US is very hard to find an audience. There is a little bit of a sense of like pretending that all of these state-owned structures, institutions, and organizations don't exist. And so it's very hard to participate in the debate. In contrast, when you go to Europe, this is like a very sort of like state-of-the-art debate about policy. I find that always fascinating and very engaging. My topic of research is what I call state-owned development banks that operate at the country level. Some of them do international operations, but mostly their missions are about promoting industrialization and growth at the country level. In my research, we've done a few surveys, and there are about 300 of these state-owned development banks around the world. And these are not multilateral development banks or regional development banks like the ones I think Daniel's going to talk about. These are really country-level financial institutions. And they are usually really big relative to the size of the economy. So you should think about banks that can be, their loans can represent 10 to 20% of the total private credit in a country. So they're pretty big. They have an influence on what happens in financial markets. And because of that, they're actually very controversial. And they're controversial because there are two views around development banks. One is the more sort of optimistic views that see development banks as solving market failures, promoting, reducing coordination problems, reducing what Daniel Roderick calls discovery costs, maybe promoting capabilities that are latent in a country, but that private banks maybe don't have the capacity to value because they can't see the future. And also promoting projects that have very high social impact, but not necessarily high net present value for a private bank. So think about a lot of environmental initiatives going on right now and the like. On the other hand, there is a pessimistic view, which I think some of the people in the audience and on the panel have also, some of the people in the panel have also defended, which is that these development banks tend to be sometimes poorly run, but they also tend to be subjects of capture. That is, they end up giving, misallocating credit, giving credit to firms, for instance, that don't really need credit, or to firms that don't really have the most impactful projects, or even worse, in some cases, they may support unproductive or failing firms just for political purposes. And so the debate really revolves around those issues. What I've done in my research, in different parts of my research, in my book, and then in a paper on development banks, and more recent on a paper on the COVID response, the possible responses to COVID by the government, is that we trace the history of these banks, just really briefly, because Carmen told me to speak only for a few minutes just to get the conversation going. These development banks are usually post-Second World War creations to promote reconstruction, the development of infrastructure. And then by the 1980s, they started to transform. And in the 1990s, I think some of them found like new missions that maybe are more entrepreneurial, as we call it, supporting small and medium enterprises, because that's where a lot of the credit rationing is and a lot of the market failures in capital markets are. And some even like more sophisticated, like the BDC in Canada, it started to promote not only sort of financial support, but very heavy technical support. Imagine a bank that has a consulting arm with former McKinsey people basically going in and supporting the project and making sure that the project succeeds. But then there are some banks that didn't read. Some banks stayed kind of like as hybrid banks. They did some of the transformation, but they still kept some of the post-war incentives and objectives. And maybe KfW, I probably, there are more people who know more about KfW. The Korea Development Bank is probably another example that are kind of in transition, but they still keep some of their older missions. And then there are big banks, really big banks like China Development Bank or the BNDES in Brazil that actually kind of kept more of the post-war mission, giving very big loans to really big firms. And until very recently, at least in Brazil, we have seen like some movement to change the mission. And the final point I want to make is that when we studied these banks, what we realized is that this transformation and this sort of like upgrading of what they do, in most cases lacked the impact evaluation of the problem. So part of why these banks are so controversial is that we don't really know whether their programs are having the impact that we think they're having. And the more we do that using experimental methods, randomized controlled trials, or sophisticated econometric studies of their impact, the more we're going to know whether the money is really doing what we hope is doing versus alternative uses. And with that said, I just want to say that because of COVID, I think some of the need for coordination has actually made development banks more important in the last year. And that may actually change the debate again, sort of like a little bit more in favor of using banks to create coordination and to try to help in the rebound. But that I'll leave that for the discussion. I'm sure that's going to go that way. Thank you.
Perfect, Aldo. Danielle, would you like to continue? Or?
Yes, okay. Well, could I try to introduce a figure? Well, first of all, I want to thank to Carmen, to the European Association of Banking History, to share this webinar. And also it's a pleasure to be with Aldo and Harry Smith in this seminar. We agree that we will try to highlight the most important points. And I would like to highlight just recent books or contributions in the last year coming still on regional development. First, my perspective is complementary of the Aldo perspective. He highlights the national development banks. I try to present the regional development banks in the world economy. These regional development banks has increased their significance in this century. There are different kinds of banks. Later on, I will try to explain a typology that we define in this book, where we look for policymakers. But let me remember, for example, in 1991, the European Investment Bank overtook to the World Bank in terms of lending, in terms of assets. Today is between 3 and 5 times larger. The European Investment Bank is the main regional development bank, the largest multilateral organization, and is mainly focused in its member states, of the European Union. But if we move to a tiny bank, the smaller regional development bank, that I was very involved in its analysis with the directors of the countries, we see that, for example, CABE, Central American Bank of Economic Integration, that is, as I said, a tiny count of poor countries for poor countries from Nicaragua, Guatemala, Honduras, lend more, but nearly 3-5 times more than the World Bank, and even then much more than the Inter-American Development Bank. Not just in 1 year, in this decade, from 2010 to 2017. We could move and we could try to analyze the typology of this bank, and we have a renaissance of these banks. Probably one of the most enigmatic development banks is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. In some way, challenge the traditional continental development bank, the continental development banks, like the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, and the Inter-American Development Bank. All these banks, together with the European Investment Bank, were created at the end of the 50s and beginning or mid of the 60s. They resemble and were regional solutions similar in the status, in the objective, but at continental level than the World Bank or the World Bank groups. But then we have groups of banks that show that even these continental regional development solutions with donors, with alternatives of contributor countries or donor countries and recipients impose or define certain conditionality. And we could explain just how before the African or the Asian, the Central American countries create a bank more similar to the European Investment Bank for the European community, like the CABE or the CAF. Well, all these changes, all these regional development banks have we'll see a turning point with the financial crisis of the 80s. And there was a change in the policy of the regional development bank in general, from what were infrastructure or social or investment project approach to a much more structural adjustment. A structural adjustment that was mainly policy oriented, market oriented, privatization, regulation, liberalization. And the most paradigmatic of this bank was the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development for the transition from the commons economies or the planned economies to market economies. But what we find now is just a renaissance of this bank, where certain banks like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is the paradigm, but other banks like the CAF, that was as well a sub-regional development bank for the Andean countries of South America, that even they didn't want Brazil or Argentina in the club, even when they were Andean countries. A bank of the poor for the poor, similar to the African Development Bank. well, this bank now is challenging the Inter-American Development Bank. It called itself the Development Bank of Latin America, and go beyond Latin America, pretend to be multipolar regional development banks. But my studies, or the studies of my group, have been much more centered in the changes that we have experienced in our debt crisis, the debt crisis that followed 2007, 2008, that we call a global financial crisis, even though it was mainly a Euro crisis. Well, the solution to this crisis, or one of the key solutions, is what we call the Juncker Plan, or European Fund of Strategic Investment. This has in consideration a transformation of the European Bank and the European Investment Fund. The main transformation, and we could extend, is transform this bank in strategic investment, in sustainable strategic investment. What the European Investment Bank, the European Investment Fund, has been called the Green Bank, or the Green Fund, for this transformation. And this goes beyond the European Union and the Project for Europe. This changed the relation. We are the contributors as well, one of the chapters of this book, the reinvention of development banking in the European Union, that established new kind of relation between the European Commission, European Investment Bank, and the national development banks. The German, the French, the Italian, not all of them. And in fact, certain countries, in particular the PIC, Portugal, Ireland, and Greece, they didn't have national development bank before the crisis, and some of them have created their own the national development bank, or certain kind of agencies similar, even regional development banks in Catalonia, for example, or Valencia, and in Germany as well, a reinvention of this bank. Establish a new kind of relation for this sustainable green bank, for this strategic investment bank, and a new architecture that in certain way resemble what has been promoted in Asia with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. This is the main point. Finally, like you suggested and follow as well Aldo's ideas, it's well, we contribute recently, just a few months, some of them still are coming, a book about public banks and COVID, and we sent in European Investment Bank and what actions. I could say that even when this is a different kind of intervention, the main idea, the main contribution is that the national development banks and even the fiscal agencies of the country have reacted much quickly than the large regional development banks. I see the continental or the sub-regionals. And it's not for a lack of resources. I think that they are reacting much slowly in terms of the kind of solution that they could implement. And so this is as well an area for the debate and the question. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for your side of the story. So let's hear now what Professor Schmidt has to say about development banks or regional development banks. Professor Schmidt, you have to unmute yourself on the left side of your...
Is what I am trying to do.
Okay, now can you hear me now? Good, okay. Thank you very much, Aldo and Daniel, for your presentations. Of course, having so few minutes for a presentation that covers things like history, impact, and political controversies about development banks and regional development banks, that is an enormous challenge, no doubt about that. When I read your presentations, as I've seen them since you kindly sent them before, it came to my mind that in talking about the role of development banks, local development banks, national development banks operating not across borders, but within the respective countries, poses something of a problem of limiting what do we talk about. Many of the development banks, for instance, in a country like Colombia or so, were development banks that would typically get funding from their respective governments, but also to a very large extent from multinational, regional, and worldwide operating banks like the World Bank or the Inter-American Development Banks. And if you look at the landscape of development banks in many countries, particularly in Latin America, but not only in Latin America, it's worth mentioning that in a typical country, you would have development finance corporation type organization that may be completely state-owned or partially state-owned, funding large development projects, large industrialist projects. You have a housing bank for social housing, another housing bank for not so social housing, an agricultural development bank, a small business bank, and so on and so on. So there's an enormous number, and the role of these banks was quite considerable. In a positive sense, they would typically counteract market incompleteness or market failure as they had existed for many, many years in most of these countries. Understandably, the market failure was something inherent in financial markets, as Stiglitz and Weiss have argued convincingly, but very often they've also been a consequence of inappropriate policies. But these inappropriate policies show up themselves in how the development banks operate. They are mostly subsidizing loans instead of providing loans. They were very often forcing people into undertaking certain investment projects which didn't make much sense, and so on. And all of this had a consequence, namely that, say, in the 1990s and a little bit later, many development banks were closed down. And it's important to understand whether this was a good move or whether it was just, say, a fashion in the economic discipline. I take the other side when I make a few comments on Daniel's presentation. If we look at what happened in the context of the great financial crisis, the regional development banks have played an important role there, in particular in overcoming the deficiency of capital flows that endangered many useful investment projects and many firms. I've observed this quite closely in the context of the European investment, the EBRD, providing funding, so to speak, as a lender of last resort to many countries in Eastern Europe, but you would find that in many other places too. So history and impact are closely related, and it would be good if, for instance, Aldo could say something about the reasons and the assessments of the reason in retrospect of why development banks fell out of favor 20 or 25 years ago.
Okay. Daniel, do you want to speak first? I was mentioned at the very end, so I don't know if you have anything to say. Thank you so much, Reinhard. I just wanted to say, so I am with you in terms of the problematics of some of these banks and why some of these were, I think some of these were closed. Some of them governments tried to close them, but they never died. Something that I've learned about development banks is that they have more lives than a cat. Like they usually don't go away. And I was just writing to someone on the chat who was asking me about, who was talking about Ireland and whether they should create a bank. The problem with the decision to create a bank is that you have to take into account that once you create it, it's going to be very hard to get rid of it, to disarticulate it. It's very hard because you create technocracies that are relatively autonomous in many ways and that end up being very powerful because they control a lot of resources. In the 90s, I think that at least this is a story that we developed for Brazil in our book. In the 90s, some of these banks realized that if they didn't help governments to privatize and to do structural reforms, they themselves were at risk of disappearing. So they started to do the transformation into more sort of hybrid banks that were now more promoting entrepreneurship and maybe, as Daniel is suggesting, like things like sustainability in the 2000s and the like. But my fear is that we're not saying development banks are always good. We're not saying development banks are always bad. But definitely, I think, and a topic that you rarely see mentioned in a lot of these studies is like we need to talk more about governance. We need to talk more about when you set up these banks, how are you going to make sure that they do what they're supposed to do, that they're not going to expand more than they should, and that they're actually going to measure the impact of what they do so that, you know, Congress, the congressional structures, the people who oversee these banks know that they're actually doing what they're supposed to do. And that is, believe me, we spent an entire year with an army of assistants looking for impact evaluation studies for 6 development banks. China Development Bank, BNDES in Brazil, Korea Development Bank, KfW, Corfo in Chile, BDC in Canada. We only found impact studies for Corfo, which is a very dynamic sort of entrepreneurial bank in Chile. They have tons of impact studies, very well done. KfW has a couple of studies here and there that look like impact evaluations, but they're not, like the methodology is not properly done. And then there are things in Brazil, in BNDES, and some of which we have done. And in some cases, we've said, like, this program, it seems to be promoting capital formation, but then we have evidence that the biggest program, which is the loan program of the bank, like there is there is no way to show that it's having the impact that the bank claims to be having. So I'm worried about the governance, and I'm worried about how we set them up and how we evaluate them. Thank you.
So basically, you cannot answer the kind of non-expert question I had, because while I got a bit deeper into the topic, I was wondering a lot how performance is measured, like, because that's straightforward or relatively straightforward with commercial banks, but when it comes to the development banks, we see them grow, we see them have a lot of state funding, we see them get more state funding during crisis, but we find it hard to measure their performance. Is that the right thing I'm getting out of this, Daniel? Would you be able to help me find out how do I measure performance here?
Well, this is a point that historically we need to analyze what was the performance in historical terms. What Aldo said, for example, the Brazilian Development Bank, National Development Bank, was absolutely different in the 60s until the 80s. In the 90s, became just an agency of privatization of the government that evaluated the financial investment, just private financial investment to take over state-owned enterprises in the country. And most recently was reinvented in the Renaissance. In Europe, like probably is what I am focused, the PIGS didn't have the national development banks. Greece still doesn't have a national development bank or a public-owned bank for development. Ireland didn't, Portugal did. Spain, during the dictatorship, had a massive number of state-owned banks, and then was reconverted, privatized. Now what is the second bank, a private bank, took over the assets of all this network of state-owned banks. And we have a tiny agency that is called ICO, is official credit, with 300 people working for the whole country. This ICO interacts as an agency with the European Investment Bank. It's not comparable with the KfW of Germany. Doesn't have programs, activities, technicians. Of these 300 that you see, I was in an interview last year before the pandemic. And the ambition is to maintain a tiny bank interacting in dialogue with the between the European Investment Bank and the European Investment Fund. And I feel that in Ireland and in Portugal, the idea is similar. They don't pretend to create a large national development bank, but just an intermediary, a very efficient intermediary. The ECO was, as well, like many of the agencies in the crisis, very active and extremely efficiency, if you want, in terms of the number of assets or in terms of the distribution per employee or per assets. But in any case, this kind of financial investment is very relative because most of the activities is with private banks, private commercial banks. It's an interaction much more with private. And our private commercial bank, the institution that demand this kind of intervention, they are not prepared or they are not interested in assuming the risk or the leverage of this kind of loans in the strategy. And well, in terms of the Green Deal or the sustainable project, I assume that the ECO will be, and probably the Irish, or just an office with a few employees of the European Financial Strategic Investment Fund, not much more than that. So these banks could be extremely efficient, in my opinion, of big strategic investments at the moment in the pandemic and in the post-crisis scenario. This is the reason that some people are talking, even the new president of the Inter-American Development Bank, that is Cuban-American, and was proposed by the former administration, is talking that certain cooperation for a certain kind of Marshall Plan for Latin America with this strategic investment and in cooperation with national development banks.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. I'm still not 100% sure I would understand how to look at the performance matter, but we will come back to that later. In the I thought, something else, please go ahead.
No, I just wanted to tell you that, for instance, it's complicated how you analyze performance, because if you give them metrics that are comparable, let's say, to commercial banks, then they may end up doing the wrong thing, which you don't want them to do, which is just to lend to the companies that are really good, that are credit worthy. This happened in Brazil during the Lula years, that the president of the National Development Bank wanted to show that they're not losing money, they're not basically bailing out bad firms, and so they lent to firms that didn't need the money, and then they showed really good, performance metrics, financial performance metrics. Another typical performance metric that I've seen used, and that is very worrisome, is that some banks are very proud of the size of their loan portfolio, and they use it, the growth in the loan portfolio, they use it as a metric of success. Which can be actually dangerous, because then it may actually create incentives to expand the bank beyond what is needed. And I've seen comments when we presented our research in the World Bank of like how in different countries the size of the loan portfolio has been used to measure performance. So that's why I think a very cool thing to do is if we could say, look, the banks are doing these projects and we're measuring the impact of this project using these methodologies that have to do with impact evaluation or similar methodologies to really look at the impact more than at the financial performance.
Yeah, no, I understand. It's a bit tricky, but yeah, it's a long discussion as well, whether or not the loan, volumes are not anyways expanding, but this is not my question seminar, so I wanted to ask the audience to contribute. So I thought perhaps first...
May I just add a comment? If you want to measure performance, you need to know what the objectives are. And performance measurement typically is done in terms that measure narrowly defined economic or financial performance. The purpose of development banks has in the past been quite different. If you look at the positive side, one of the aims was to create something like social cohesion or economic integration. Or if you want to look at things from the bad side, and then you need to go back to early studies about development banks, it was their almost explicit purpose to enrich those people who had influence and strong shoulders and measured by this standard, they did a very good job. How much money has flown through development banks into the pockets of the rich? The most impressive documentation of all of this is AID's spring review of the 1970s.
Well, yeah, it's kind of a political discussion a little bit as well we're going to have, I guess. Shall we, so I wanted to ask Bob, first Noel, then Bob, and then Panizza, I don't know your first name, and Luigi to address their question in person. Noel, would you like to start your video and ask your question?
Hi.
Hello.
Everybody. Greetings from Ireland.
Hello.
Hello. First off, I'd like to say, Professor Smith, I'm just glad I'm on the same platform as you today. Just a little bit of background to my work. I work for a charity-based group which looked at local and regional development. And following on from the crash of 2008, we realised that the banks were bailed out to the tune of 64 million. So we looked at the whole idea of local and regional development, and we engaged with the SBFIC in Germany, which I worked with them for 4 years, where we put together a business plan outlining 10 regional banks that would bring credit back into local communities, and to look at SMEs was the main task. But that's just the background. So maybe in the future, Professor Smith, I might be able to engage with you on a later time. Anyway, my question. The closest thing that Ireland has to a development bank is the Strategic Banking Corporation of Ireland, the SBCI, which is actually only an intermediary and not a full bank. What further benefits could occur to the Irish state by expanding SBCI into a full development bank, taking into consideration that Ireland's banking system is dysfunctional, having only two main pillar banks that control the vast majority of retail banking in the country? With the state having a large shareholding in one of these as a result of the bailout after the 2008 financial crash, I should add that the SBCI get their funding from the European Investment Bank and KfW, and most of their funds are filtered through our pillar banks, but they've kind of expanded that role, but they don't hold a banking license, but they're just an intermediary. That's my question.
Do you want me to answer?
Yes, please.
Okay. I think that is a very interesting question. And in fact, we analyzed just in one of the books that is coming, I can send different banks. And I said before, we have the German National Development Bank, the KfW, that is a huge technocratic bureaucracy. And you have tiny national development banks. In fact, I think that in Ireland, the SBICI is just a tiny intermediary. And I doubt that the ambition is to create a large technocratic bureaucracy. Probably this institution is for dialogue, how to implement the European FCSI that is similar in Ireland, that is called Irish Fund of Strategic Investment, to complement the European Fund, to evaluate specifically, probably with young postgraduates, just not with big bureaucrats. And if the worry of Aldo is that if we create big technocratic bureaucracies or in this National Development Bank, and finally they want to maintain in itself, my impression in interviews with some directors of these national development banks in Europe, if they want to train the people just in the short term for 5 or 10 years, and they are worried that when they are training them, the main incentive is to go to work to Luxembourg, to the European Investment Bank. They are not thinking all this training of evaluation, financial, economic, social, technological, and environmental projects, as well, for me, much important in social, all the cohesion for NGOs and charities and groups like you suggested at the beginning, that finally will not be internalized like these banks that are not necessarily national development bank or commercial banks. That is just keep people, few people, in the case of Spain, for a country of more than 40 million, 300 people. 1/3 of them are postgraduates, earning probably less than 1,000 euros per month, that are doing their postgraduate practice placement to evaluate these European funds, and these funds that are not given necessarily by the government, are given by the European taxpayers in much more general terms, to promote the green Europe, the social Europe, and the technological development Europe.
Thank you, Daniel. So we have a lot of questions, so I think we can try to be like a little bit fast. So Bob, would you like to ask the next question?
Sure.
Hi.
Good, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. My question is that there's a lot of projects out there in the world that need funding for infrastructure, small business financing, solving credit constraint problems, and so on. There's no small list for sure. The question is, are there some of those projects that are done better by development banks than by the national or regional international governments through, say, legislation or direct spending, and vice versa? Are there some projects that are better done by the governments rather than development banks? Thank you.
Yeah, I actually wrote an answer. I think it was your question in the Q&A, Bob. That I feel it depends on the country. Like there's a lot of variation on that. Like if you know, like KfW may be like really good at promoting sustainability and having programs to you know, to switch households to green energy and sustain more renewables and more sustainable I don't know, light bulbs and things like that, than the Korean Development Bank and the Brazilian National Development Bank, etc. But and so there are some places where the multilaterals or the regional development banks, I think that they exert pressures that are more effective at promoting these kinds of things than the domestic banks, because these and Daniel probably can talk about this more, that these regional and multilateral banks, you know, they have the standards that they have for loans in terms of compliance are very, very high standards, and they're usually determined in Europe or in Washington, D.C. And so they tend to be like a lot more, like a lot stricter when it comes to like the impact they're going to have on these specific things. So I feel that if you think about developing countries, I would say that the multilaterals have been more effective than domestic national banks at promoting key things like environmental policies, sometimes even like poverty fighting policies, sometimes are better promoted there. Other things are very clear, like promoting competition and the like openness to like lowering barriers to entry, things like that. The multilaterals have exerted more pressure than the domestic banks, I think.
I think on a general sense, one should think that governments have certain parties that back these governments, and these parties have members, and they represent interest groups. Development banks are some form of organization, even if they are state-owned, that enjoy a certain autonomy and could resist partial interests and partial pressures a little bit more. But this is a very general rule, and its application is very different from country to country. That depends on the tradition of the general administration, and it depends, of course, on the governance of the respective development bank or development institution. So in general, it makes sense to say a somewhat autonomous development bank may be more suitable than a government and a pure government administration part. And regional development bank might even be better. And one could even go one step further. The more multinational it is, the more it is removed from partial interests in the respective recipient country.
Thank you, everybody, for your answers. I think Luigi is next with his or her question. Hello.
Hello. Thank you, everybody. It was an extremely interesting presentation. Thank you to all the speakers. I would like to, is a kind of between an observation and a question, because Professor Musacchio have listed as quite clear evoke the importance of enhancing the evaluation capacity of those of national banks. He flagged the issue of impact evaluation studies undertaken by several national development banks across the world. However, I believe like the issue of evaluation can be a bit reshaped by maybe pointing out that impact studies can only be, I would say, the one element of a broader effort for institutionalization and enhancement of an evaluation culture of development banks. Because it's not a matter of undertaking one study, whether actually highly rigorous or not. As Professor Schmidt, I think, pointed out, is also a matter of enhancing the transparency of the operation, having clarity of objectives, really re-establishing the position eventually and resources for undertaking different type of evaluations within organization. Not necessarily impact studies, but also evaluation of corporate tools, corporate instruments. So maybe I would like to hear from panelists actually whether actually they've come across a kind of an assessment of how different national banks stands, not only in terms of a really delivery study, but actually in terms of institutionalization of evaluation capacity. I believe like, okay, Chile and KfW are still like well performing, but I believe there's a big potential for other national bank to fill this gap. Thank you.
If I may say, just because I just saw a comment from someone from the National Development Bank in Brazil who is a friend and who created the impact evaluation unit, who helped create the impact evaluation unit in the bank. So Luigi, I think the trend, and the trend is that I think some of these banks are starting to create this impact evaluation studies, that the impact evaluation is not only done using like a static, okay, let's do a randomized control trial this year and see what happened, but really trying to look at very broad things like spillovers, hopefully long-term issues. Luigi and I think we were talking on the chat about it would be interesting for these banks not only to look at the short term, but really look at the long term, the impact in the long term. Now that it's very trendy right now in economics to look at persistence, right? Like how like a policy can have persistence in the long run. And with development bank policy, it would be actually relatively easy to do. For instance, looking at a region that had like a big project with a development bank compared to a similar region that didn't have that policy, and then to track them like for decades and see if that specific program has differential impacts and the like. That I am all in favor for that, Luigi.
Okay, thank you, Aldo. The next question comes from Ugo Panica. Would you like to ask a question now?
Sure. Thank you. First of all, thank you for organizing this. Just one quick question / comment. So I fully agree with Aldo that governance, and I guess with everybody, the governance is really the key. And a bit related to what was being discussed before, there is this puzzle, I don't know if it's a puzzle, that there is a sort of consensus that multilateral development banks are okay. They're not perfect, but they're not horrible. While the consensus is changing, but the view on national development bank is less positive. And the key question there is like, what makes the governance so different? Is the fact that in the multilateral we have many countries, or there is other fundamental difference? So I always found amusing that not so much now, but 10, 15 years ago, the biggest critics of national development banks were at the World Bank, which is it's a development bank. And so it's like, why are you different from these guys?
Not only that, Hugo, but the World Bank created most of the development banks around the world. Like they provided the initial funding to launch the development banks in the 50s, 60s, 70s.
And they're still the main channel through which they channel funds, right?
And now they're trying to get rid of it. It's one of those paradoxes of capitalism. I personally, now that I've been more involved with multilateral banks, I'm not even sure that they have more impact. I think that they have a better reputation of at least having more, because of the compliance and the standard for the loans and things like that are higher. I'm not even sure that the impact is higher in all respects. Like I think we would need to do more impact evaluation studies, but there are more evaluation studies of what happens. I think the practices are definitely more clear or clearer when you go to multilateral development banks. There's tons of studies, right? Like you cannot do a lot of things if you don't show with a study that it's working. So for me, that's the reputational thing. The other thing is that it's harder to capture a multilateral bank. Not that it doesn't happen, by the way. Like I'm from Latin America, and so everything can happen, but it's harder for a political party to go to Washington, D.C. and convince them, the Inter-American Development Bank, that they should promote a very specific thing. It may happen, but it's very hard. While it's easier to capture a local national development bank to do something that has political objectives rather than strong economic objectives.
May I add a sentence to what has been said before, namely focusing on governance? I certainly agree very much with the request to say it's important that the development finance institution has a sound governance structure. Even though it's not very easy to say what exactly is a good governance structure. But it's not only governance, it's also business policy and business organization. I vividly remember the situation when I talked to someone very much at the top of a development bank in Guatemala many years ago, and asked him, why on earth do you centralize so many decisions that should better be decentralized? And the answer was really typical of the time and of the region. The answer was, if I have a handicapped niece, I need to make sure that she gets a job as a secretary.
Well, I was wondering, Aldo, Daniel, did you see any questions in the Q&A you would probably like to address in speaking? Or...
I thought Juan Flores had it's a very broad comment question.
Okay. You want to read it and make your comment?
Oh, I thought he was going to do it live.
Whose question? Say again, who was Afan?
Hi, Aldo. Hi, Daniel. Thank you very much for these very interesting presentations. No, I was wondering whether there would be some time to discuss about the role of development banks in the present and the current crisis, right? And I was thinking perhaps challenges in terms of coordination with the central banks, with other financial actors, with the governments, and perhaps, and if I may be a little bit pessimistic, whether we should also see a kind of inequality that will emerge, like developed banks which emerge in rather favorable institutional contexts will perform better, and there will be space for positive influence. Whereas in countries where this institutional context is rather poor, that the impact will also be negative or even non-existing. So I was wondering what you guys think about this.
Yeah, I don't know if Daniel wants to go first, but
well, just a short answer is that, well, it is obvious that the nature of the state conditions the nature of the institutions in the country, and national development banks are not independent, are not autonomous agency. So the autonomy of the states is important as well in the case of national development banks. In general, we can say that if regional development or multilateral are better. I think that there are different kinds of multilateral development banks or regional development banks. But what we have seen is that there is a trend that certain countries are looking for certain governance inside the institution like the KB, where they have more control, less conditionality. On the other hand, this trend, I think that is changing as well. For example, the Inter-American Development Bank at the moment, that is looking cooperation with the World Bank and with other development banks, like the CAF, for example. And I think that more than is better national or regional, in this crisis, probably it's important to what can they do together. And in certain cases, we need to use the innovation in the institution, like in the case of Ireland or the case of Portugal, how we create these, call them fiscal agent intermediaries or national development banks to react with common policies. This is my impression as well, and as well is based in interviews, in meetings, in documents of what should be the approach at this moment. And this approach in the pandemic should be different as well than the approach, for example, of the Green Deal or sustainable project, or how to create more cohesion in general, not cohesion in the pandemic, cohesion in general in the society. I don't know if I answered or addressed your question.
Let me add something that I think is relevant also to Noel's question about Ireland, that like in Canada, we started the case of BDC, which is a bank that maybe very few of us know. It's a very small bank and it's very technical. It's almost like a consulting group, right? That can actually give loans as well. But the loan, sometimes banks come to them with the projects. They're like, look, there is this project that I cannot fund, but it looks interesting for you. And it's a small structure, but very, very effective in achieving the objectives. And they've done studies of like what happens when you give a loan without the technical assistance, what happens when you give the loan and you send your consultants to actually work with the company. And it's like the level of effectiveness is very different. And so it leaves you thinking that, you know, maybe in a place like Ireland, they can do something like that. But maybe that same system, if you bring it if you take it to Nicaragua or Guatemala, as Reinhard was mentioning, like it would probably don't work as well, because ultimately the quality of government is going to determine the quality of institutions, and specifically the quality also of the people who work in these places, and the capacity that politicians have to capture what the banks do is going to hinder this. I thought Daniel was going to talk more about the CAF, because it's a very interesting example where you create capacity at a regional level. This is a very technical, technocratic, let's say, bank that goes, let's say, it goes to Ecuador to help pineapple producers, but they send a lot of technical support as well. So it's not only funding, but technical support. And they help them in organizing trading and the like. And I feel those kinds of banks that sort of like replace some of the institutional voids in the countries where they operate are probably in the long run going to be more effective than trying to create domestic banks in places where institutions are just not going to be supportive. I don't know, Juan, if you're happy with those answers.
Even if you're not, I would strongly support it.
Okay, for now we won't find out about Juan's happiness, but so
I am happy.
Yeah, that's good. I thought we can have a last comment of Thomas Marois. I can't pronounce your name, but you're welcome to ask your question, and then probably everybody can have a last thought about our topic before we conclude. Unless there's a very important other question, then please raise your hand and I'll be happy to let you ask. Okay, Thomas, please.
Thank you. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm just wondering, in terms of the governance question, quite often it's set in quite technical terms, and it hasn't really been raised in terms of democratization or the capacity of society to impact the missions and structures and operations of development banks. And there's certainly plenty of positive examples around the world, but also more importantly, in the context of COVID, in the context of Green New Deals, new ways, things like, you know, creating citizen engaged missions by which we can impact and substantially change the ways in which development banks, public banks operate. And thank you very much for your discussion today. Okay,
I guess that's an interesting question. I thought about it, like in the 1990s, for instance, Thomas, one of the development banks in Mexico helped with the privatizations of like railways and things like that. So they actually had like billions of dollars in their safe, let's say in their account. And they had, like, in order to invest them, they had very strict criteria, like of how they could invest it. All the projects needed to meet like a certain private and public return, like a net, there was like a net social present value that you had to calculate. It was very strict. And I remember that most of the projects didn't pass the test. So this, you basically had billions of dollars parked for a few years until someone said like, hey, maybe we should change the criteria. And I remember this happened in a time when the society actually was claiming for a lot of things. And it would have been interesting to see what the society would have wanted this money to be spent on. Not that you just want to give like full reign to voters, but I felt like there are these moments where like the extreme technocratic approach can actually end up having sort of like creating social tensions and the like. So it would be interesting to see, for instance, you could create like like these banks usually have committees, like credit committees that decide on what they're doing and where they're going. And I wonder if you could have like, for instance, either someone from Congress or some sort of like citizen representative of sorts to get involved in this process, just so that they see that this is a transparent process that follows like, you know, methodologies that make sense.
Yeah, thank you, Aldo. I think that would probably be a little bit along the lines of my conclusions before I let all of you conclude that I still have a bit of some insecurities about the size of some of the development institutions and actually how the accountability is in the end. I mean, this idea of a lot of money being parked somewhere that might have been more severe decades ago, but I don't think it has gone entirely away. So I think there is a lot of more work to be done to really have a better sense for everybody about how good development banks do. Yeah, let me ask you for your conclusions, Harry Schmidt. What would you think? Do development banks do good?
Good development banks do good. The danger is that many development banks are not good. That is because many banks are not good. And development banks are a bit more political, sometimes not only a bit more political, but a great deal more political. And that would typically detract from whatever we have as goodness indicators. Therefore, very much depends on the situation of the country, the culture in the country, the tradition of bureaucracy, the notion of professionalism, and so on. If we distinguish between national and international organizations in this development finance business, then I have a certain inclination to support the international organizations because that provides a certain bit of isolation to pressure to allow enrichment of the rich. And in the past, there was a great deal of enrichment in the rich, not only in terms of the loans they would get, and when they had strong shoulders, they would typically be able to avoid repaying their respective loans, but also in terms of sending their nephews and cousins into the organizations and making sure that they would benefit. But that, of course, is a problem which you also find with purely private banks. Private banks are not the standard by which you should evaluate public banks. Let me just add one remark referring to the chat. I think it was a person with the name of Farva who asked for the source referring to which I referred, the spring review of AID. Just go to the homepage of J.D. van Pischke, although he recently died last December. You would certainly find a homepage or reference to his work, or to Claudio Gonzalez Vega or Ohio State University. All of these people were heavily involved in that work, which started the modern discussion about the drawbacks of government-owned development banks.
Okay, Daniel, what do you think about our discussion? What would you conclude?
It's a hard question to generalize about institutions, multilateral, regional, or national. But for example, the debate about the World Bank, inspired all these banks or give legitimacy to the existing ones. But the World Bank was not independent of pressure groups or political or ideological influence as well. In fact, was as well a victim of these policies as well in different moments. And so we have a continuous reinvention. I think what Aldo suggested is the importance of the bureaucracies or the techno bureaucracies inside these institutions, and how they are autonomous of the political power, or they are autonomous or are totally dependent along different phases or periods. Is the techno bureaucrats define the objectives of the countries, or the democratic system or the autonomous government define the objectives of the banks that is part of the bank? That could be the multilaterals, the regional, or the national development bank programs. And as well, this essential as well, the other dimension that we have introduced is the relation between public and private. All the first was the public dimension, as well, what is the relation between public bank, international public bank, national public banks, and the private bank and the private sector in the process of development, in the process of social investment, environmental investment. This is for me, the central question that we have today.
Thank you, Daniel. Aldo, the last word is yours.
Thank you. So very briefly, I think it's very clear that better institutions give you better operating development banks and the like, but we can also not just say that's the recipe, because then if you're a poor country with bad institutions, then there is no solution for you. And I think what we're learning is that the more that we work on the governance at the bank level, the more we work on the quality of the technocrats, the kind of autonomy those technocratic bodies need to have, and we improve the measures of impact, then you can start to think about having some of these banks in developing countries. Now, not huge banks, like Carmen is worried about the size. So we don't want huge banks. We want banks that attend the places where you really have market failures, like the small and very entrepreneurial firms. And I think that we're learning a lot about how to do that. Like there's a lot of work coming out of the people who study entrepreneurship, of like what formulas work better to support very small enterprises. And you don't need a gigantic bureaucracy to do that. Unfortunately, you do need a very capable bureaucracy to do that, as Daniel was mentioning. And that may be the institutional challenge that ends up hindering who can have an effective bank or not. But I am not saying, we should never have these banks. And Juan asked about COVID and the role that development banks can play. And I feel we haven't talked too much about that, but in these moments where you have basically the kinds of conditions that remind us of the post-war period, where you need like coordination, where you need like funding just to get going again after everything has been closed, you could think that these banks could play an important role in the rebound of their economy. So I actually think that right now, having a development bank and using it in a clever way to promote the rebound could be actually kind of interesting. It could make a big difference. Thank you, Carmen.
Thank you. I guess in a few years' time, we will be here again to evaluate whether or not this aim to organize the rebound has actually worked out, or whether there's things to improve. Thank you, everybody, for your participation, for sharing your insight. Thank you to all the participants, and have a nice day further on, wherever you are. Bye.